Hey everybody, who's your Jedi here with another review for you. This time we're talking the episode 1 of season 2 of Legends of Tomorrow called Out of Time. And for this special occasion, I thought I'd bust out the Flash hat I bought a couple of weeks ago. It's appropriately DC enough, I think, and especially given some of the things that happened in this episode. But let's kind of get right into it. So, overall, I thought this was a pretty good episode. There were one or two things that I kind of had some problems with, but overall, I thought this was a very strong episode. As people have said, this really does feel kind of like what the show should have been from the beginning. It seemed like they were kind of trying to play it safe that first season, and here they're just, let's go nuts. And that's all well and good. I mean, it is a comic book show, so let's go nuts is, in my book, kind of the way you want to do these things. But this has kind of come back to the one problem that I tend to have with time travel shows, particularly, is that they often make a big deal about the butterfly effect, and then totally interfere with history in ways that should totally change the entire world, but nothing ever really changes. For example, they sort of make Einstein go out and give half the credit for his discoveries to his ex-wife. I kind of have a feeling that if you change the way people perceive one of the greatest scientific minds of the 20th century, that would probably have a rather notable change on society. I mean, it even says, this is going to sort of change the way people think of genius. And that kind of strikes me as something that would have a rather notable effect on history. Although I will give the show credit for points that Einstein macking on those ladies like that. Yeah, in real life, Einstein, to put it bluntly, really did treat his wife pretty badly. So yeah. Also points for historical accuracy in terms of the Salem witch trials, people being hanged rather than burned at the stake. Nobody was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. Everybody was either hanged, and then there was one guy who refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty, and he was pressed to death, which basically they held him down and put heavy stones on him and just said, dude, enter a plea and we'll stop this. The guy, whose name escapes me at the moment, simply responded with more weight. So that was basically a pretty big middle finger to the whole thing, the process of the Salem witch trials. Although also, if he entered a plea, from what I actually did a quick checkup on this, if he'd actually entered a plea and was found guilty, which he almost certainly would have been, they'd have been able to confiscate his property because he never entered a plea. His property was able to pass on to his son-in-law and thus stay in the family. So, and the guy at the time was 81 years old, so points to that tough old Puritan for whatever his motivations in doing that. So anyway, let's get right into this. It is nice to see that from the way things pick up right off from the start that the team are working together. They're a very well-oiled machine. Enough time has passed that people sort of moved on from the loss of Snart at the end of last season. So, things are going well for the team. Of course, the team is also behaving ridiculously irresponsibly and not listening to it, doing all sorts of things like, using superpowers in 17th century France, and hilariously, Sarah sleeping with Anne of Austria, who, if I remember correctly, despite her name, was actually raised in Spain. Things get weird if you're familiar with the history of the Habsburgs. Things get kind of weird, but whatevs. So this ultimately does lead us into our main thing of Damien Darhk is helping the Nazis to nuke New York City in 1942. One thing that did bother me is that I really did kind of expect him to sort of pick right up with where things were with Rex Tyler last time around. And I understand why they kind of skipped past that, but them doing that just seems like you leave us on this big cliffhanger and then you jump 6 months ahead and you just sort of get filled in the background of what this guy said. It's like, wait a minute, shouldn't everybody have had like a million questions for this guy and all this other stuff? So that, in my mind, is one of the big weaknesses of the episode. Let's see. Now, people have noted that it's interesting. Last season on Arrow, Damien Dark even explicitly said that he thinks Nazis are scum. Yet here he is working with them in this episode. It's possible Dark might have changed his mind after the events of the Second World War. He does sort of have his own sort of twisted, I wouldn't exactly say morality, but worldview. So I guess certain types of genocide are okay in his mind, but others are not. Or possibly the writers just forgot about that particular line. Because, if you're going to go into the early 1940s and have superheroes battle bad guys, of course you're going to have them fight Nazis. And it was pretty hilarious seeing Heatwave like, I love burning Nazis. Well, I mean, they are Nazis, right? And of course, as one you expect, Sarah is totally down with, I'm going to kill Damien Dark to save my sister, despite the fact part of the thing was you can't mess with history to save your family, otherwise terrible things happen, which, that was Rip's big thing last season. That's what's going on with Barry over on The Flash recently. Sarah is, in a lot of ways, very interesting that she's simultaneously an extremely disciplined person and yet also an extremely impulsive person. I mean, we all knew that this was going to happen. There was just no way Sarah was not going to try and kill Damien Dark, no matter what happened. And of course she had to do that because there's no drama if she doesn't. Now, what I did like is that when she fights Dark, he more or less does win the fight, which is kind of fits in with what we saw last season on Arrow, where he doesn't have that magic idol yet, if I understand the timeline correctly. And it really took until the final confrontation where he got serious with his physical skills. And, it was even my reading when I was watching those episodes last season that he sort of let his abilities as a physical combatant atrophy and relied more and more on his magic, which doubtlessly was probably pretty helpful for Oliver ultimately being able to kill him at the end of last season. But here, this is Damien Dark with his full physical abilities, and as good as Sarah is, she's not up to taking him on, which has got to be a really, really bitter pill for her to swallow, given that she's undoubtedly probably one of the most, in this time era, deadly people trained by the League of Assassins. I mean, Oliver kicked Talia al Ghul's Nyssa al Ghul's butt several times, but Sarah proved to be somebody who was on par with him pretty well. So, yeah. And I guess we should say, it was really cool seeing Oliver pop up in this episode, and I was so disappointed with this whole, I don't have time for a time travel adventure. I'm like, oh, come on, give me the Doctor Who moment where they kind of no, you can travel in time all you want, still be back in time for tea or whatever. This is America. But nonetheless, it was kind of cool to see Oliver on Legends again. This time, modern Oliver, not possible future Oliver. Now, the Dr. Haywood guy, he's the fella who in the comics ultimately becomes Citizen Steel and is the grandson of the World War II hero Commander Steel. This isn't a character I was really terribly familiar with, but years ago I read one of the Jeff Johns JSA storylines, and it was the story of how this guy went from being pretty much an ordinary dude, realizing he had superpowers, and choosing to follow in his grandfather's path and becoming Citizen Steel. And it was a really, really good story about, legacies of superheroes and, taking up the mantle and all this other stuff. So I have a feeling that will be part of that particular character's journey. Him with this whole thing is like, oh yeah, it was easy. All I had to do was to look at a calendar. It was to basically kind of figure out that Oliver Queen was the Green Arrow. Kind of ignoring that Oliver actually took more than a few steps in the first season to make sure that people wouldn't do that, even deliberately getting himself arrested as the vigilante, only for the cops to have to go, oh, whoops, turns out Oliver Queen's not the vigilante after all. So kind of ignoring that, and never mind that Roy Harper is believed to have been the original vigilante. But okay, don't think about this sort of thing too much. So let's see. What else do we have to talk about? Kind of interesting to see the way that Sarah and Ray are bouncing off of each other. When Sarah gets pissed off at Ray, she more or less throws something very similar into his face to what Captain America said to Tony Stark in the first Avengers movie. It's like, hey, man, without that suit, you're nothing. Which is not true. I mean, Ray is still a genius billionaire. He doesn't have access to all that at the moment. And I assume he's also probably picked up a little bit of physical training from the other members of the team. Like Tony Stark in the comics certainly did. Like there have been scenes of him expressly being trained by Captain America, and even remember reading one story where some guys were trying to kidnap him, and he said to this thug like, "Hey man, do you know what a clavicle is?" The guy goes, "No." And he chops him. He goes, "Yeah, that's the bone in your bone I just broke." Yeah, comic book Tony Stark is a pretty badass dude, even without the Iron Man. Other fun stuff was definitely watching, Martin Stein fanboy over Einstein, which, understandable. It was really hilarious how Einstein is like, you know what, Heatwave is the smart one of the two. And I definitely love him going like, yeah, Heatwave calling the whole thing a nerd party. That was great. Kind of annoying to see that, like, when they get grabbed and are sent back in medieval times. One, what in the world was Rip thinking? I mean, was there like pre-programmed destinations for these people, or was this random? Because sending people back to the Jurassic period or whenever it was, Tyrannosauruses were running around. Not a very good idea. But anyway, when Stein and Jax get grabbed by the guards about to be beheaded, they seem to conveniently forget, like, hey, we can just merge into Firestorm and get out of this situation, no problem. A bit of a reoccurring problem, as some people have noted. Let's see, what else? Definitely some very good action stuff this time around. I mean, they really, really did the action stuff well, particularly the fight between Sarah and Damien Dark. Thought that was really cool. And now, if you've been reading the press releases, you know that Reverse Flash and Damien Dark are going to be on the show, and what this is all leading up to with those two characters. I'm not going to spoil it for people who don't read the press releases about stuff, the official announcements, but I got to say I'm super excited. The thing I don't get though is I really, really want to know Reverse Flash's motives for doing this, because he's one of those guys that's sort of like, yeah, you got to be really careful about mucking with history. Otherwise, bad stuff can happen, and Time Wraiths will appear and try to kill you, or turn you into the Black Flash and drag you off, like what happened with Zoom. Here, it's sort of like, okay, dude, last time around, you couldn't kill Eddie because he was your ancestor. You didn't want to erase yourself from history. So I'm pretty sure, like, New York getting nuked in 1942 would alter history enough so that you would never be born. Like, Eddie's parents would probably never be born. Whatever. Also, it's also kind of a little silly to think that if New York City was destroyed, that would basically be the ultimate fall of the Allies would never be able to successfully win World War II. Okay, keep in mind this happened sometime in 1942. Japan attacked the United States in December of 1941. So the U.S. was already moving to getting into World War II. Now, granted, if New York had gotten blown up, that would have been a very serious blow, but the U.S. could have endured that. And if you thought that Pearl Harbor getting attacked would galvanize the United States, imagine what would happen if the Nazis blew up New York. I mean, yikes. I mean, look at what happened when some guys blew up a small portion of Manhattan about 15 years ago. More or less, the U.S. went out and wrecked two entire countries as payback. You actually blow up New York, yeah, anybody who's sitting on the fence there, yeah, never mind the reaction from other countries. I mean, and never mind the fact that any sort of realistic scenario that when results in a Nazi victory in World War II is um, pretty out there. But again, comic books, you gotta roll with the story. So yeah, there are definitely a few missteps here and there, but oh yeah, at the end, the Justice Society shows up at the very end, and it's a little unclear if they're supposed to be heroes who are from the 1940s. I'm gonna assume so. I don't know if they're gonna be time travelers as well. It certainly is possible, but I guess we'll find out next season. I mean, next episode. It is interesting to note that they do have Dr. Midnight on there, and he has been changed so that he's being played by a black actor. I haven't, in the comics, he's a white guy, which, you know what, I'm totally cool with. It's going to be interesting to see, especially if you stop and think about it, because you're going to have, two female characters, two characters that are black. Obsidian in the comics is gay, and it has been stated on the show that he will also be gay on the show. So this is if they are from the 1940s, they're incredibly open-minded for the 1940s. This even suddenly reminds me of the story I read. It was like Tio Morrow had gone back in time and brought the original Justice Society to modern times and showed them all the bad stuff about modern times and said, like, yeah, here's these guys, the Justice League, and they're your successors, and they've allowed the world to be like this. And they're looking at things like these people from the 1940s are being shown like porno shops and rap videos and like heroin addicts laying around in their own filth, and they basically say, yeah, yes, the Justice League's future must not be allowed to come to pass. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that superheroes from the 1940s would probably not approve of in terms of stuff from 2016. So, we'll just have to see how all of this plays out. But I am extremely excited for this. Especially Stargirl. She is a really cool character. I like her quite a lot. And this is actually, if I remember correctly, they had Stargirl on Smallville, so definitely interested to see how things play out with her. And if you're, of course, familiar with the character, you know that she's a character who's very special to Jeff Johns, one of the main people behind the DC entertainment world these days. But we'll talk about that another time. So, guys, I'm going to call it here. As always, please comment, rate, subscribe, and of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Who's Your Jedi, and please also join me on Tumblr, Jedi Reviewer. Until next time, take care and have a good one.